Human history has always been driven by a desire to push beyond the horizon. Long before modern maps, ancient rulers and merchants set out on journeys that seemed impossible. Some were quests for wealth, others for knowledge or survival, but all carried enormous risks. So for today's video, we're going to count down 15 of the most daring ancient expeditions. Starting with number 15, the expedition of Harkuf to Nubia. One of the earliest documented expeditions in history comes from the autobiography of Harkuf, a high-ranking official in Egypt during the reign of the pharaoh Menrere in the 6th dynasty. His tomb inscriptions at Aswan provide a detailed account of his travels south into Nubia, making it one of the best preserved examples of an ancient exploratory mission. Harkuf led multiple expeditions into Nubia, that's the region along the Nile to the south of Egypt, which was rich in resources like incense, ivory, ebony, animal skins, and even exotic animals. These expeditions were diplomatic and commercial in nature, and his records describe journeys through dangerous desert routes and negotiations with local rulers. Harkuf was tasked with bringing back goods that symbolized wealth and power in the Egyptian society, as well as forging alliances with Nubian chiefs. Now, what makes it pretty cool was the scale of the challenge. Nubia was a region of just rugged terrain and harsh desert where travel was slow and perilous. Encounters with local tribes could turn hostile, so diplomacy was just as important as logistics. Harkuf notes that he was able to return safely with large amounts of valuable goods, which earned him great prestige at his court. But the most famous part of his record is the mention of a pygmy that he brought back from Nubia. This individual was intended as an entertainer and possibly a symbolic figure for the Egyptian court, where such individuals were considered rare and precious. Pharaoh Pepi II himself, a child at the time, wrote directly to Harkuf expressing excitement about the arrival of this pygmy, instructing that he be brought to Egypt safely. The letter, preserved on Harkuf's tomb walls, was one of the earliest examples of royal correspondence that we have. While the details are limited to his own inscriptions, which naturally highlight his successes, the records provide rare insights into the difficulties of traveling and negotiating beyond Egypt's borders more than 4,000 years ago. His journey stands out, undertaken not for conquest, but for trade, diplomacy, and cultural enrichment. Number 14, the voyage of Hanno the Navigator. One of the boldest recorded expeditions of the ancient Mediterranean was the voyage of Hanno the Navigator, a Carthaginian commander who sailed down the west coast of Africa in the early 5th century BCE. His journey is preserved in Greek translation of a Punic inscription known as the Periplus of Hanno, which describes a large-scale exploratory mission beyond the Pillars of Hercules, now known as the Strait of Gibraltar. According to the text, Hanno commanded a fleet of 60 ships carrying around 30,000 people. This number is debated by historians, and it may include settlers or simply be an exaggeration, but the expedition was clearly significant in scale. The voyage combined exploration, colonization, and trade, and Hanno first established the colonies along the Atlantic coast of Morocco, securing Carthage's influence in the region. From there, he pressed further south into unknown waters, encountering landscapes and peoples unfamiliar to Mediterranean sailors. The Periplus describes rivers teeming with crocodiles, hippopotamuses, thickly forested coasts, and mountains that seem to burn with fire. Many scholars believe that this last reference may describe Mount Cameroon, a volcanic peak on the West African coast. If true, it suggests Hanno's fleet traveled far into the Gulf of Guinea. That was a remarkable feat for this time. The account also records encounters with indigenous peoples, some friendly and willing to trade, others hostile, and at one point the Carthaginians attempted to capture strange, hairy creatures described as gorillae. Well, that description's been linked by modern scholars to gorillas and chimpanzees, though the exact identification is uncertain. But Hanno reports that the sailors killed some of these creatures and brought their skins back to Carthage, where they were displayed in the temples. Even with the uncertainties of the text, like exaggerated numbers and vague descriptions, the expedition stands as one of the furthest documented explorations of the ancient world. While some details remain debated, the Periplus is generally regarded as a reliable outline of a real voyage. It shows that Carthaginian explorers reached well beyond the familiar coasts of Europe and North Africa, pushing into regions that wouldn't be well known again until the age of exploration more than 1,000 years later. Number 13. The Expedition of Pytheas of Massalia. One extraordinary exploratory journey of antiquity was undertaken by Pytheas, a Greek geographer and navigator from the colony of Massalia, that's modern-day Marseille in southern France. Around 325 BCE, Pytheas set out from the Mediterranean into the Atlantic Ocean and traveled further north than any Greek explorer before him, reaching lands that were as mysterious to the Mediterranean world as anything else. His voyage was known to us only through fragments cited by later authors, but even in those fragments, it's one of the most daring expeditions of the ancient world. Pytheas' journey took him beyond the Pillars of Hercules, that's the Strait of Gibraltar, into the rough Atlantic waters that most Mediterranean sailors avoided. From there, he sailed northward along the coasts of Gaul and possibly Britain. His account, later summarized by authors like Strabo and Pliny the Elder, indicate that he circumnavigated part of the British Isles. He described Britain as a large island and gave surprisingly accurate information about its size and geography compared to what was previously known in the Mediterranean. Even more remarkable, he claimed to have reached the land he called Thule, a place 6 days' sail north of Britain. His description of Thule includes details of a place where the summer days were very long and the sea was described as thick, slushy, or frozen. Most historians believe that this description matches part of Norway, Iceland, or perhaps even the Faroe Islands. If true, Pytheas was the first known Mediterranean explorer to describe Arctic or subarctic worlds, centuries before the Vikings made their famous voyages. Pytheas also described the midnight sun. That's the phenomenon of continuous daylight that happens near the Arctic Circle in the summer. For his contemporaries, this was nearly unbelievable, and later writers like Strabo openly doubted his claims. Yet modern science confirms that his description matches real phenomena in the far northern latitudes. Despite the skepticism of some ancient scholars, Pytheas' voyage was likely genuine. His account includes many details that were not otherwise known in the Mediterranean, and later exploration corroborated much of what he wrote. That said, because of his original text now is lost, we rely on some hostile summaries from other writers, which makes it difficult to separate his first-hand observations from later distortions. Even if not all of his details were accepted, though, his legacy persisted in the idea of Thule, which remained in European thought for centuries as a symbol of the distant, mysterious north. His journey is one of the most impressive examples of ancient exploration, achieved with limited navigation technology and in seas and oceans few Mediterranean soldiers ever dared to enter. Number 12. Nearchus's voyage from the Indus to the Persian Gulf. In the aftermath of Alexander the Great's conquest of India, one of his most trusted naval commanders, Nearchus of Crete, was tasked with leading a daring expedition. His mission was to set sail from the Indus River, where Alexander's forces had campaigned, all the way to the Persian Gulf, re-establishing contact with the heart of the empire and exploring coastlines largely unknown to the Greeks. This voyage was undertaken in 325 BCE. It was one of the most ambitious naval expeditions of antiquity. Nearchus commanded a fleet of triremes and other ships that had been assembled and repaired along the Indus. The journey was treacherous from the start. The fleet had to navigate unfamiliar waters with unpredictable tides, monsoon winds, and dangerous shoals. Nearchus and his men lacked any detailed maps or prior knowledge of the coastlines they were exploring, making every stretch of the journey a venture into the unknown. The voyage took them along the coast of modern-day Pakistan and Iran, and the conditions were often brutal. The sailors struggled to find fresh water, and the arid Makran coast offered little in the way of supplies. Food shortages forced the crew to rely on whatever resources they could find, sometimes going hungry for days. Nearchus's own account, preserved in Arrian's Indica, emphasizes the hardships. Disease spread among the crew, ships were damaged in storms, and encounters with unfamiliar people sometimes turned hostile. Despite the difficulties, though, the expedition achieved some remarkable feats. Nearchus charted much of the coastline, noting harbors, rivers, and landmarks. He observed and recorded details about the tides of the Indian Ocean, which were unlike anything known to Greek sailors at the time. But one of the most significant aspects of his voyage was its role in reconnecting Alexander's scattered forces. While Alexander's army marched overland through the desert, suffering heavy losses, Nearchus's fleet provided an essential line of communication and supply. The successful arrival of the fleet in the Persian Gulf was a major and symbolic victory, demonstrating the reach of Alexander's empire and the possibilities of long-distance naval power. The voyage of Nearchus is remembered not only for its daring, but for its accuracy of the observations. Arrian, who wrote centuries later, relied heavily on Nearchus's first-hand account, praising its detail and its reliability. While some exaggerations do exist, the general consistency of his narrative with later geographical knowledge confirms its credibility. In the shadow of Alexander's more famous conquests, this achievement of Nearchus is sometimes overlooked, but in terms of sheer courage and endurance, his voyage was one of the great daring expeditions in antiquity. Number 11. The expedition of Hanno's successors. While the Carthaginian navigator Hanno became famous for pushing south along the coast of Africa, another Carthaginian explorer, Himilco, ventured northwards into the Atlantic during the same period. His expedition was far less well documented than Hanno's, but ancient references confirm that it took place, and it was one of the earliest Mediterranean journeys into the cold waters of northwestern Europe. Himilco's voyage is mentioned by the Roman poet Avienus, writing from the 4th century CE, who drew on earlier, now lost sources. According to Avienus, Himilco sailed from Carthage through the Strait of Gibraltar and north along the Atlantic coast of the Iberian Peninsula, eventually reaching the coasts of Gaul and possibly as far as the British Isles. Carthaginian interest in this direction was commercial. They were keen to secure trade routes for tin, lead, and other metals mined in Britain and Brittany, as well as amber from northern Europe. Avienus describes the voyage as perilous. Himilco's ships faced long periods of fog, seaweed-choked calm water that slowed progress. These details sound very much like descriptions of the Bay of Biscay or possibly even the Sargasso Sea. Himilco reported encounters with hostile weather and difficult navigation, which made the expedition hazardous compared to Mediterranean sailing. But despite the fragmentary evidence, the voyage of Himilco is significant because it shows that Carthaginian exploration extended not only southward toward Africa, but also northward into Europe. While the lack of detailed records leaves uncertainty about the exact extent of his journey, the surviving references make clear that he and his crew sailed well beyond the limits of ordinary navigation. Together with Hanno's better-known voyage, Himilco's journeys show how Carthage combined commerce, exploration, and secrecy to dominate the seaborne trade of the ancient Western Mediterranean. Number 10. The expedition of Zhang Quan to Central Asia. One of the most important expeditions in Chinese history wasn't a military campaign, but an exploratory and diplomatic mission. In the 2nd century BCE, during the reign of Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty, the envoy Zhang Quan was sent westward to establish contact with distant peoples. His journeys would open a way that would become the Silk Road, one of the most famous trade networks in world history. Zhang Quan's first mission began around 138 BCE. His task was to reach the Weiji, a nomadic people living in Central Asia, and seek their alliance against a confederation of nomads who frequently raided Han territory. To accomplish this, he had to travel thousands of kilometers through unfamiliar land. His expedition was immediately intercepted by the Xiongnu, and he spent more than a decade in captivity before eventually escaping. Despite the enormous setback, though, he continued his mission westward. After crossing Central Asia, he reached the territory of the Weiji near Bactria in modern Afghanistan. Although the Weiji were not interested in joining an alliance against the Xiongnu, Zhang Quan collected invaluable information about the geography, cultures, and economies of the regions he passed through. He eventually did return to China after more than 13 years away. His reports astonished the Han court. He described lands as far away as Dawan, the Fergana Valley, with its famous horses, and spoke of a distant civilization connected by trade routes. His detailed accounts convinced Emperor Wu that China could pursue new alliances and commerce with the peoples of Central Asia. The significance of Zhang Quan's expeditions cannot be overstated. Though his original goal of securing military allies failed, his journeys laid the groundwork for the Silk Road, which would link China with Central Asia, India, Persia, and eventually Rome. The transmission of goods and ideas and technologies across Eurasia in the following centuries owes much to the daring of this single envoy who was willing to endure captivity, long marches, and dangerous crossings to bring back knowledge of distant lands. His accuracy of his observations made him one of the most important explorers of antiquity, remembered in Chinese history as the father of the Silk Road. Number 9. The expedition of Cambyses II into Nubia and the Ethiopian land. When Cambyses II, the son of Cyrus the Great, ascended to the throne of Persia in the mid-6th century BCE, the Achaemenid Empire was still expanding. Cambyses is most often remembered for his conquest of Egypt in 525 BCE, but ancient sources also tell of another, far less successful undertaking, his expedition southward into Nubia and Ethiopia. Our knowledge of this expedition comes primarily from Herodotus, who wrote in the 5th century BCE. According to him, after conquering Egypt, Cambyses sought to extend his control further southward towards the rich and mysterious land of Ethiopia. Ethiopia in Herodotus' usage referred broadly to the region south of Egypt and Nubia, encompassing what we now think of as the Sudan and possibly the Horn of Africa. For the Persians, this was terra incognita, a land of great wealth, exotic peoples, and formidable geography. Herodotus describes how Cambyses, intrigued by tales of Ethiopia's riches, sent spies disguised as envoys bearing gifts for the Ethiopian king. Their mission was to learn more about the land, its customs, and its strengths. The Ethiopians reportedly saw through the deception and mocked the Persians, dismissing Cambyses' pretensions to power. Angered by the insult, Cambyses decided to march an army into Ethiopia and conquer it. To supply such a large army across distances required careful planning, yet Herodotus insists Cambyses ignored the warnings of his advisors and plunged ahead without preparation. As the army marched deeper into Nubia, supplies dwindled. Herodotus paints a grim picture of the soldiers starving in the desert. When rations ran out, they ate pack animals, then grass and roots, and eventually resorted to cannibalism in desperation. Ultimately, Cambyses was forced to abandon the campaign and retreat back to Egypt, his army shattered by hunger and exhaustion. For centuries, historians have debated whether Herodotus' account was exaggerated. Some modern scholars believe that Cambyses did send expeditions into Nubia, but that all were small reconnaissance forces rather than massive invasions, Herodotus suggests. Evidence does show Persian presence in the Nile Valley south of Egypt, including garrisons and forts near the Second Cataract, confirming that Cambyses did extend control into part of Nubia, but it seems unlikely he penetrated far into the Ethiopian highlands. From a modern perspective, though, the expedition is an example of the limits of ancient imperial expansion. Armies could conquer huge territories in fertile regions like Mesopotamia or Anatolia, but deserts and mountains imposed some pretty harsh barriers. It also shows the human cost of exploration and conquest into antiquity. Thousands of soldiers likely perished not in battle, but from thirst, hunger, and exposure. Though remembered as a failure, Cambyses' Ethiopian expedition deserves a place among the most daring undertakings of the ancient world. It shows the risk of overreach, the harshness of the African landscape, and the enduring human drive to push beyond the boundaries of what we know. Number 8. The circumnavigation of Africa by Phoenician sailors. One of the most astonishing claims of ancient exploration comes from Herodotus again, who, writing in the 5th century BCE, recorded that Phoenician sailors, under the orders of Pharaoh Necho II of Egypt, had circumnavigated the entire continent of Africa nearly 2 centuries earlier. According to Herodotus, Necho ordered Phoenician crews to sail out from the Red Sea, follow the African coastline, and return to Egypt through the Mediterranean by way of the Pillars of Hercules. If true, this voyage would have been the earliest known circumnavigation of Africa, predating Portuguese exploration by more than 2,000 years. The account given by Herodotus is short, but it's striking. He writes that the Phoenicians took 3 years to complete their journey. Each year, when the sailing season ended, they would land, sow grain, and harvest it before setting out again. This detail, odd though it may sound, is one of the strongest arguments for the authenticity of the voyage. It shows the practical realities of these long expeditions. The sailors couldn't carry enough provisions for years at sea, so they paused to grow food as they moved along unfamiliar coasts. Most remarkable in Herodotus' report is the sailors' observation that at one point in their journey, the sun was on their right-hand side as they sailed westward. For Mediterranean readers, this claim was baffling, and Herodotus himself doubted it. But modern geography makes sense of that statement. When sailing around southern Africa into the southern hemisphere, the sun does indeed appear to the north. This small but crucial observation strongly suggests the sailors really did round the Cape of Good Hope. But the expedition's impact on Egypt itself is unclear. Herodotus doesn't record what political or commercial benefits were gained, and there's little evidence that Egypt capitalized on the achievement. It may have been primarily seen as a demonstration of power, proving that Necho's resources could command a voyage around the world's largest continent. For the Phoenicians, though, it would have been yet another demonstration of their unmatched abilities as navigators. Whether or not the sailors truly made it all the way around Africa, the expedition as described was among the most daring of antiquity, and it represents both the ambition of the ancient rulers and the skills of Phoenician mariners, who were willing to push beyond the known edges of the map. Moving on to number 7, the Expedition of the 10,000. Unlike other expeditions on this list, which were launched by rulers or states, the journey of the 10,000 was an unplanned, desperate march of survival. In 401 BCE, a large army of Greek mercenaries found themselves stranded deep in Persian territory after their employer, Cyrus the Younger, was killed in battle. Their retreat is one of the most remarkable expeditions of the ancient world, not for discovery, but for endurance against overwhelming odds. Cyrus the Greek had hired mercenaries to help him seize the Persian throne from his brother, Artaxerxes II. The Greeks fought bravely at the Battle of Cunaxa near Babylon, and even won their part of the field. But Cyrus was killed during the fighting, leaving the army without a patron or purpose. Suddenly, more than 10,000 Greeks found themselves stranded over 1,000 miles from home, surrounded by hostile Persian forces. The Persians attempted to negotiate, but soon treacherously murdered the Greek generals during a supposed meeting. At this critical moment, new leaders emerged from the ranks. Among them, Xenophon, an Athenian soldier and writer. Under his leadership, the mercenaries organized themselves and resolved to march north to the Black Sea, where they could find passage back to Greece. What followed was a grueling trek across some of the harshest terrain in Asia. The 10,000 marched through Mesopotamian plains, over the snowy mountains of Armenia, and across barren highlands where food was scarce. Xenophon's narratives give vivid detail of the suffering. Men were forced to eat meager rations, freezing nights in mountain passes, and desperate battles to seize supplies. Despite the hard times, though, the army maintained their remarkable discipline. The Greeks organized their march in defensive formations, protected their baggage trains, and adapted to unfamiliar conditions. Xenophon's leadership, along with that of others, kept morale high enough for the army to keep moving. Their cry of joy when they finally reached the Black Sea, Thalata Thalata, the sea, remains one of the most famous moments in ancient literature, and it symbolizes their survival after unimaginable hardship. Xenophon's work, Anabasis, preserves the details of the march in a clear first-hand account, making it one of the best documented expeditions of antiquity. His descriptions provide insight into geography, local peoples, and the logistics of ancient campaigning. But above all, it's a story of survival and leadership. It demonstrated courage, discipline, and determination that could carry an army across hostile lands, even when everything seemed lost. For that reason, it deserves a place among the greatest expeditions of antiquity. Number 6. The Voyage of Eudoxus of Cyzicus. In the late 2nd century BCE, a Greek navigator named Eudoxus attempted one of the most daring maritime expeditions of antiquity to circumnavigate Africa and reach India by sailing westward from the Mediterranean. His story, preserved mainly in the writings of Strabo, reveals the bold ambition of Hellenistic seafarers and the extraordinary risks they were willing to take. Eudoxus first became known for his voyages to India. Under the patronage of King Ptolemy VIII of Egypt, he sailed through the Red Sea and into the Indian Ocean, bringing back valuable cargoes of spices, gems, and other goods. These early voyages followed established routes that Arab and Indian traders had long used, but for the Greeks, they represented new horizons. Eudoxus's success demonstrated that long-distance trade with India could be undertaken directly. But Eudoxus wasn't content to stop there. According to Strabo, after one of his Indian voyages, Eudoxus was blown off course and landed on the eastern coast of Africa. There, he encountered people and landscapes unfamiliar to Mediterranean people. More importantly, he reportedly acquired parts of a shipwreck that locals told him had come from the west. This convinced Eudoxus that Africa could be circumnavigated, that by sailing west from the Pillars of Hercules, one might eventually reach the Indian Ocean and return to Egypt by sea. Inspired by this possibility, Eudoxus prepared for an expedition unlike any attempted before. He gathered supplies, ships, and crews, and he set out from the western Mediterranean into the Atlantic. Now, the details of his voyage are sparse, but Strabo notes that he faced enormous difficulties, including storms, hostile encounters, and the scale of the journey. He reached far down the Atlantic coast of Africa, but was eventually forced to turn back, his expedition exhausted and unable to continue. Undeterred, Eudoxus tried again. On his second attempt, he prepared even more thoroughly, assembling a fleet and planning established colonies along the way to support his progress. However, the outcome of this expedition is uncertain. Strabo reports that Eudoxus sailed again into the Atlantic and was never heard from again. Although his final fate remains a mystery, the attempts stand as some of the boldest maritime ventures of the ancient world. His motivation wasn't simply curiosity, but the potential for enormous profit. Direct access to Indian and African goods promised wealth beyond measure. And though overshadowed by more famous explorers, Eudoxus deserves recognition as one of antiquity's most daring seafarers. Number 5. Alexander the Great's march through the Gedrosian Desert. One of the most brutal yet daring expeditions of the ancient world was not undertaken by sailors, but by an army on foot. In 325 BCE, after his campaigns in India, Alexander the Great led his forces back towards Persia. Instead of taking the safer, more established routes, he chose to march through the Gedrosian Desert, that's modern-day Makran in southern Pakistan and Iran. This decision nearly destroyed his army, yet it stands as one of the most remarkable tests of endurance in antiquity. The reason for Alexander's choice are debated. Some sources suggest he wanted to punish his men, who had mutinied and refused to march deeper into India. Others argue he sought to emulate earlier mythical journeys, proving that he could achieve what no other leader dared attempt. Whatever his motives, the march was undertaken with tens of thousands of soldiers, camp followers, and animals, all burdened with the spoils of years of conquest. The Gedrosian Desert was one of the harshest environments. It stretched for hundreds of kilometers, it offered little water, few sources of food, and of course extreme temperatures. Ancient writers like Arrian and Curtius Rufus describe how the army struggled from the very beginning. Wells were scarce, and when water was found, it was often brackish and barely drinkable. Food quickly ran out, and it forced the men to slaughter pack animals for meat. Even so, hunger and thirst killed many. Arrian reports that at one point, when a small quantity of water was collected in a helmet and offered to Alexander, he poured it on the ground in front of his men, demonstrating solidarity and refusing to drink what his soldiers could not share. Acts like this helped maintain morale, but they did little to alleviate the suffering. It was so great that even Alexander's contemporaries criticized the decision, viewing it as reckless. Yet the march through the desert also revealed Alexander's determination and the resilience of his army. Despite the conditions, discipline was maintained and the force did not disintegrate. The survivors carried with them a story of endurance that reinforced Alexander's reputation for pushing the limits of possibility. The march through the Gedrosian Desert remains one of the most daring expeditions in antiquity, not for what it discovered, but for what it revealed about ambition and the fine line between boldness and folly. Number 4. The expedition of Hannibal across the Alps. Few military campaigns in antiquity are remembered with such amazement as Hannibal's march across the Alps during the Second Punic War. In 218 BCE, Hannibal Barca, commander of Carthage's forces, led an army, including cavalry and, famously, war elephants, across one of the most formidable natural barriers in Europe to strike at the heart of Rome. This feat has gone down in history as not just a brilliant tactical maneuver, but also one of the most daring expeditions of the ancient world. His goal was audacious. Instead of defending Carthage's territories in Spain or Sicily, he decided to carry the war directly into Italy. To do so, he needed to march his army from Iberia across southern Gaul and then cross the Alps into the Po Valley. The Alps, with their peaks and treacherous passes, were considered nearly impassable for large armies. Attempting a crossing with tens of thousands of soldiers, horses, and a contingent of elephants was almost unimaginable. Ancient sources, including Polybius and Livy, provided details, though sometimes conflicting accounts of the journey. Hannibal started with maybe 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and about 37 elephants. The march through Gaul brought its own difficulties, as Hannibal had to negotiate with or fight against local tribes. But once he reached the Alps, though, the true ordeal began. The army faced narrow paths, sudden rockfalls, and snowstorms, and progress was painfully slow, with some accounts describing desperate measures like cutting new paths through rock or using vinegar to break down obstacles. The most dramatic aspect of this expedition was the use of war elephants. These animals are symbols of Carthaginian power. They struggled terribly in the cold. Many perished along the way, but their presence boosted morale, and it terrified enemies once the army reached Italy. The image of elephants trudging through snow became emblematic of Hannibal's determination to achieve the impossible. Despite enormous losses, though, Polybius estimated that fewer than half of the army survived the crossing. Hannibal emerged into the Po Valley with enough strength to launch a campaign that would shake Rome to its core. That daring maneuver allowed him to surprise the Romans, defeating them in a series of battles that culminated in the devastating victory at Cannae in 216 BCE. This crossing required not only courage, but also extraordinary leadership and planning. Number 3. The expedition of Pythagoras' student Democedes to the Persian court. One of the most unusual expeditions in antiquity wasn't a military campaign or a voyage of exploration, but a mission of medicine and diplomacy that carried a Greek physician deep into the Persian Empire. Democedes of Croton, a celebrated doctor from the Magna Graecia, or southern Italy, was captured by Persians and taken to the court of King Darius I around 520 BCE. His forced journey and later mission into Greece, recorded by Herodotus, provide a rare account of cross-cultural expeditions. Democedes began his career in Croton, a Greek city renowned for producing physicians and philosophers. His medical skills soon brought him to the attention of powerful rulers, including Polycrates, the tyrant of Samos. After Polycrates was killed, Democedes fell into Persian hands and was taken as a prisoner to Susa, the Persian capital. There he was presented to King Darius I, who had suffered an injury to his foot that none of his court physicians could treat. Democedes applied Greek medical knowledge and successfully cured the king. That success transformed his life. From a captive, he became the trusted physician of the most powerful man in the world. He was showered with wealth and privileges, but remained essentially a prisoner in Persia, far from his homeland. Herodotus recalls that after curing Darius, Democedes was sent with Persian envoys on a mission to Greece. Ostensibly, the purpose was to gather information and establish relations, but in reality, it was reconnaissance in preparation for Persian expansion. The group traveled through coastal Greek cities, observing their defenses and resources, and Democedes, still longing for freedom, used the opportunity to plan his escape. In his home city, Croton, he finally slipped away from his Persian guards and rejoined his countrymen. The Persians attempted to recapture him, but the population defended him and he was able to remain free. The Persian envoys, however, were captured by Croton and handed over to the Spartans, who executed them. This episode, minor in the grand sweep of history, highlights the precarious position of individuals caught between empires and how a single physician's journey could have diplomatic consequences. Number 2. The voyages of Feshan to India. One remarkable expedition in antiquity was not led by a general, merchant, or king, but by a Buddhist monk. Feshan, who lived in China during the late 4th and early 5th century CE, undertook an extraordinary pilgrimage that carried him thousands of kilometers across Central Asia and India. His journey lasted more than a decade. It combined religious devotion with exploration and provided one of the earliest detailed records of India and Central Asia from a Chinese perspective. Feshan set out in 399 CE, already in his 60s, from the eastern Jin dynasty capital in China. His motivation was simple but ambitious: to obtain complete and accurate copies of Buddhist texts, particularly those concerning monastic rules, which were not fully available in China. His route took him westward along what would later be called the Silk Road. He crossed the Gobi Desert, a treacherous expanse, and according to his own account, known as the Fuguoji, the record of Buddhist kingdoms, the desert crossing was among the most difficult parts of his journey. Food was scarce and travelers were at constant risk of losing their way. Many died of thirst, yet Feishan persevered, driven by his religious purpose. Feishan was also an acute observer of Indian society. He described cities, governments, and customs, noting the prosperity of the Gupta Empire. He remarked on the justice system, the administration of law, and the role of Buddhism in Indian life. He was impressed by the generosity of Indian rulers towards monks and the flourishing of monasteries, where he collected many texts and relics. Travel for him was never easy. He often walked weeks between cities and exposed to the elements with limited supplies. He faced bandits, wild animals, and disease, yet he pressed on, reaching Sri Lanka after crossing the Indian Ocean. There he spent several years studying and copying scriptures, and his journey then turned into a true maritime expedition. He boarded a trading vessel bound for Southeast Asia. Storms blew the ship off course and the passengers suffered from hunger and fear as they drifted across the Bay of Bengal. Eventually, they landed in Java, where Feishan stayed for months before finding another ship heading north. The significance of Feishan's expedition cannot be overstated. His writings provide some of the earliest first-hand Chinese accounts of India, Sri Lanka, and Southeast Asia. They reveal the extent of Buddhist networks across Asia and show how ideas, practices, and texts move along with people. His records of Buddhist kingdoms remains one of the most important travel accounts of the ancient world, an example of the courage of a man whose daring lay not in conquest, but in devotion. Number 1. The expedition of Hatshepsut to Punt. One of the most daring expeditions in the ancient world was launched not by a king, but by a queen, Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh of Egypt's 18th dynasty. Around 1470 BCE, she sent a fleet of ships on a long and difficult journey to a land the Egyptians called Punt, a distant region whose exact location is still debated, but it's generally believed to have been along the Horn of Africa. The purpose of the expedition was trade. Punt was famous for producing luxury goods highly prized in Egypt: frankincense, myrrh, ebony, ivory, exotic animal skins, and even live animals like baboons. To secure direct access to Punt's wealth, Hatshepsut organized one of the most ambitious overseas voyages in Egyptian history. When the fleet reached Punt, the Egyptians were received by the local rulers, depicted on Hatshepsut's temple walls as King Parahu and Queen Ati. The reliefs show Punt as a prosperous land with houses on stilts, palm trees, and abundant goods. One unique feature of this expedition was the transport of live myrrh trees back to Egypt, intended for planting in temple gardens. This is the earliest recorded example of an attempt at transplanting foreign plants for religious purposes. The return voyage was just as dangerous as the outward journey. The heavily laden ships had to cross the Red Sea again, battling wind and the risk of capsizing. That they returned safely is clear from the triumphant depictions, which celebrate the success of the mission as one of the crowning achievements of her reign. Although the exact location of Punt is still uncertain, the expedition itself is not. Archaeological and textual evidence confirms that Egypt maintains contacts with Punt over many centuries, but Hatshepsut's voyage was the most famous and best documented. Her expedition to Punt stands as a culmination of the most daring journeys in antiquity. It combined political power, economic ambition, religious devotion, and naval skill, all directed towards a land that lay far beyond the edge of Egypt's known world.